Hi, my name is Lisa Richter. I'm Director of Industry Outreach and Growth for CSIA. Welcome to this masterclass. Before we get started, a quick word about CSIA. Maybe most of you here today are familiar with the association, but if you are not, all you really need to know is that CSIA's mission is to help system integrators build better businesses. How do we do that? Well, for starters, we have a team of volunteer SIs who have crowdsourced a best practices manual to help SIs scale their businesses. In fact, the BP committee just released a beta version of the latest manual, which is 6.1. CSA also offers a certification program and other resources, including professional development, learning from peers, access to vetted professional services companies. These are things like insurance and legal. These companies really understand an SI's unique business needs. For partner members, CSA offers an ecosystem to grow your SI programs, understand your customers' pain points, monitor industry trends, and share your thought leadership. With thousands of qualified integrators and suppliers, the CSIA Industrial Automation Exchange helps SIs, industry suppliers, and manufacturers connect and do business. For SIs and partners, it provides a platform to support your content and SEO marketing efforts, position yourself as a thought leader, and nurture prospects during their complicated buyer's journey. If you are not currently a CSIA member, now is a great time to join. Membership provides you and your entire team a full lineup of virtual events and other resources from accounting to sales to operations 365 days per year. It also means you and your team can attend the CSIA conference because this annual in-person event is members only. If you are currently a member, thank you. If you want to just get a flavor of CSIA and its members, I encourage you to listen to the Talking Industrial Automation podcast. CSIA members talk all things industrial automation, and it's just a great way to hear what your peers are up to. One last housekeeping note before I turn it over to today's speaker. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom. This helps us stay organized. You're welcome to chat amongst yourselves using that chat feature, but it's super helpful if you put your questions in the Q&A feature. The session is being recorded, and you will get a link to the recording in the next day or so. At this time, I would like to turn it over to today's speaker, Quentin. Take it away.
Thank you, Lisa. Let me start sharing my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. Sorry, it took me a second there. My name is Quentin Lowry. I'm business development for Softing. Today, we're going to be talking about the tManager. In Logix rack, tManager module connects your PLC to a SQL database or to an MQTT broker. We've had this product for a while. It is a Rockwell Encompass product. So it is approved by them. We're a part of their partnership team. And with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started. The topics we're going to cover today is fairly simple. I have a really short PowerPoint. It's just several slides. We'll talk about what tManager is, how it's used, different applications, maybe some of the roots of why the module was created. We'll talk about how it's unique compared to other solutions that are out there. And then we'll actually do a demo. I try to spend a bulk portion of my time on that demo, lets you all see how it works, how it functions, and really helps with that Q&A as well. When you actually see something in action, it kind of jogs your memory and kind of maybe lets you come up with better questions or see how it actually functions. So I think the most benefit we get from that, but we'll use the PowerPoint to do a quick overview, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So what is the tManager? As I already stated, it is an in-chassis module. We do have a ControlLogix and a CompactLogix version. You can see little pictures of them down here at the bottom. And we try to make a really clean, easy solution that is in rack with the PLC. So one of the benefits you get with that is that it communicates across the backplane. And we try to keep it super easy to configure. And we'll get into that with the demo. That's why we want to show that. but it's a clean connection from your PLC to some type of data system, whether it be a SQL database, an MQTT broker. If it's tying into an MES system or something like that via the SQL or MQTT, that can happen as well. We support a wide variety of things to connect to, as you can see there. We support AWS IoT, Azure, PostgreSQL, Microsoft SQL is by far the most common that we see, but Oracle, MySQL, some of the open source stuff as well. Our customers are using it in a lot of different applications. As you can imagine, um, PLCs are used in a wide different amount of application, and so are SQL database. So really anywhere where you're trying to get data back and forth between those two, the module can be a solution there. Um, it has its roots in track and trace. So as products moving around the production line, you want to make sure it's past the different station before it's allowed to run at the next station and record all those values, serial number, whatever it may be, the parameters that it was used to build. That's where it has its roots for the automotive industry, but I've seen customers use it for a wide variety of things. How the module is unique versus other solutions that are out there is that it is a hardware module and it is in rack. There's benefits to that, and that I said earlier, uh, it communicates across the backplane. So even if the network was to go down, it can still talk to that ControlLogix PLC that it's in rack with. It can still communicate to it. We do have built-in store and forward, buffer that data up until the network returns and move that data to the database in that application. It is really easy to configure. So we essentially point it to the PLC. It looks at the PLC, requests all the program and control tags, and pulls that into the module. Same on the database. We look at the database, we see the structure of the table, the columns, the data types, all that information, their names. If it's a stored procedure, input, output parameters, gather all that, pull it into the module. So it's a couple of clicks to do that, and we'll see that in the demo. But once you have those, as you can see in the picture there, you can essentially just map, hey, I want this PLC tag to go to this part of the database, and set up under what conditions you want that to take place. Another benefit of it being in a hardware module, it is an embedded device. You're not worried about updates, Windows updates, or anything like that. There's no nothing like that to cause downtime. It is also very intertwined with the PLC, in that we can give status and feedback to let you know how those transactions are running. So that's something that I think is pretty critical for a hardware module. A lot of our customers that are regulated, whether it be pharmaceutical, food and bev, aerospace, love using the hardware module because it is in rack and it is that close to the processor that, hey, the network goes down, that's okay. We can still talk to the PLC, buffer that data that's being processed within the PLC, and send it to the database when it comes back up. As I stated earlier, there are two versions of the module. There is a ControlLogix and a CompactLogix version. I'll use this slide to kind of talk about the differences between them. So the ControlLogix, we recommend it to talk to a max of 16 controllers. It can do more than that. If you wanted to do a lot more than that, you could create a data concentrator to do that. But with it making its own SIP connections directly to the controller, we recommend 16. The CompactLogix is limited to 3, and it is 3 CompactLogix controllers. It will not talk to a ControlLogix PLC directly. It also does everything via Ethernet IP, so it's not communicating across the bus in that 1769 form factor. It will talk to the newer version 5069 form factor. It just needs an IP address to be on the same network with that 5069 and talk to it. Both modules are configured very similarly. They both have 2 Ethernet ports. A lot of times I get questions like, why 2? And that's just to give the user an easy way to say, hey, I'm going to put 1 Ethernet NIC on the automation floor, and maybe you already have a database or you're tying into a system that's more on the IT or business level side. That's what that second Ethernet port is for, to easily connect into that. You don't have to do that. If you want to use 1 Ethernet port for everything, if your database and your PLCs and everything are on the same network, you only need to use 1. But that's the reason 2 are there. They are independent and isolated from each other, so you don't have to worry about routing or any type of network passing through either one of those. The module's not doing any of that. And I bring that up because IT sometimes has concerns with that. So just be aware that they are air gapped, that there's no data passing between the two ports on there. They both have store and forward. They have roughly 5 gigs worth of store and forward built into each one, and they function very similarly as far as the transactions and connections that they can make to the databases or the brokers and the PLCs. So with that being said, we can jump into the demo. I just use this slide to talk about what we're going to interface with, because it is mainly, I'm going to be driving our software, which is a free download, by the way. You don't have to pay for it. You can download it, install it wherever you want. But I am going to talk to a ControlLogix tManager. It's going to communicate across the backplane to a ControlLogix PLC that's in rack with it. And then we'll move data back and forth between it and a SQL database or the cloud, either one. I'll probably show you both if we have time. And so we'll just do some simple transactions and start setting that up. So let me drag this over here on my share screen. So this is what our software looks like. Like I said, it is an application you can download, install wherever you want. Do be aware that this application is only used to configure the module. Once you configure the module, you close it out. It doesn't run in the background or anything. If you were to connect to a module, you simply input either one of the IP addresses of those 2 ports on the module. You got to have username and password. By default, it's admin. So click there, you log in, you can see, hey, this is the module. You can see how hard it's working, how long it's been up. And I'll go through some of the settings here, but I'm not going to bore you to death with all of them. I will point out this is where that store and forward memory is allocated from, and we'll just move through some of this and actually set up a transaction. So under administration, this is where you configure the module as far as IP addresses, username, passwords, all that good stuff. So if I click on network, you can see here's the 2 IP addresses. Pretty basic stuff. If you're using DHCP or static IP address, you can use that here. So mine, I have it here in my office, and the PLC is isolated. So one port is just here on my little local network. This port's actually going, since I go out to AWS, I got to get out onto the business network to get routed out. So it's set up DHCP. It just pulls it from the business side, and then I have connectivity to the internet that way. If you're using any DNS servers or gateways, we can accommodate that here as well. I will point out that you can do pings and trace routes from the hardware module itself. So this isn't from my PC that has this application installed, but it's actually taking the path of the actual hardware that's in rack. So that can be really useful for troubleshooting when you're commissioning a system. But I do want to point that out because maybe you can try to connect to a SQL database or a remote PLC that's being networked together. It's like, hey, can I at least ping the thing or do a trace route to see if you're getting blocked anywhere? Something that's useful for our system integrators and OEM type customers, especially if you do very similar systems quite frequently, and for our end customers who have multiple locations or multiple machines, you can take backups of the module. You can see I can take just the transaction backup, which is basically all my transactions and my connections to the database and the PLC, and I can load that on other modules, so you don't have to configure all this by hand each time. Once you have it set up once, you can import, export different transactions and projects and load them on other ones to save hassle. So I do point that out just because if you are managing multiple devices. I would also point out something that tends to play a role most of the time, right? Most of the time, if we're logging data or we're doing transactions, trying to create a trend or a history, you want to have a time source. You can have the time source be the PLC itself. As you can see here, I could sync to my PLC. In my case, I just have network time protocols that I'm going out to. And a lot of times I have customers who actually create their SQL server to be the NTP server as well. So that way the tManager and the SQL server on the same time sync. And then you can also push time to the PLC device. So in this case, I go out, I sync with a network time protocol server. And once that syncs, I then push and sync time to the PLC so that everything's on the same time source. None of the data is going to be, you're not going to have a lot of variation, right, when you're writing data to the database. So I do point that out because it is normally critical, especially if you're utilizing store and forward. Say the network was to go down, all that data getting logged, if you didn't have it being timestamped by the module or by the PLC and those transactions, maybe the database is down for a day or two. And then once it comes back up, the module writes all that data. It would have, if the SQL Server was populating that, it would all get populated at once and you wouldn't know when things actually took place. So that can be critical. You shouldn't need to worry about licensing. It comes licensed with whatever database type you pick. If you want to, so you can connect to multiple database types as well as multiple databases. It's when you get into multiple database types that you could bump into a license change or need to purchase an additional license. But most of the time, I'd say 85–90% of our customers are only connecting to one database type, and you have to order it with a database type. Updates, come out with those. Username and password. So especially with integrators, OEMs, sometimes you have multiple people playing with the module. Maybe you got a database guy touching one portion of the module and somebody touching the automation side. You can set up different usernames and passwords and restrict access to that. So if I wanted somebody to be able to only manage the automation side or the IT side, being the database, you can set that up. This is also recorded in the audit log. It's not something that's used often, but it can be very useful in those scenarios where you have multiple people configuring or messing with the module at once. So I do point that out. But for what everybody cares about is the actual transactions, right? The stuff I've been going through is kind of the boring stuff, the settings, IP addresses, time source, all the basic general configuration of the module. But for what we all care about, it's like, hey, let's actually set something up. Let's run a transaction and get data moving. So to do that, you can see here under projects, I don't have anything listed. If I was to click new, I could just type in CSIA. You can see it creates that. If I double click on it, it opens up my project editor, but it moved it to my other screen over here. So let me put this over here. And you can see I can define my controller connection. I can define my database connection. And then once I've done both of those, I can connect those together and set up a transaction between the two. So for the controller connection, you can see this module is actually the one in slot 3. I have a couple different options with this ControlLogix module. I can talk directly across the backplane to this PLC, which is how it's configured now. I can also pass through dedicated bridge cards and go across the network to different PLCs that may be on that network. So even if you had multiple bridge cards in here, say you have a rack that has multiple network bridges connected to it, and you put the tManager in that rack, it can go out and just utilize that same path like RS Links does and go out across the network and gather all that data and bridge it using those bridge cards to pull it all in. And then you could also turn on, hey, let's just go straight out the front ports of the module itself. And that's how our compact Logix version set up. So I have customers who a lot of times put these in racks by themselves with power and treat it as a standalone. I even have some people that put it in the server room close to their database, and they just use this to go out across the network and gather data from their PLCs that way. To configure the PLC, it's really easy. You right click on it, say configure the selected module, give it whatever name you want. By default, it defaults to the program name within the controller. Hit OK. It should turn green. It does. If I wanted to update the tag list, I simply right click on it, do that. But then I can right click, open tag list, and there's the controller and program tags. So it's really easy to configure. If I was to do an Ethernet IP, it's somewhere. I'll just say right click, connect to a module, pick the flavor that I want to talk to. You can see we support some of the older stuff as well. You got PLC 5s and slicks on there, and a wide variety of the Rockwell PLCs can be supported. So I would just make everybody aware of that. But once you've got one defined, like I said, you could connect up to 16 at once, but I'm only interfacing with the one. You're good to set something up. On the database side, we try to keep it as easy as well. So I say new MS SQL adapter, input the IP address or host name of that machine that's got the database on it. You want to input the database name and then the username and password. You can hit validate connection, and that just essentially says, hey, I'm going to go out, I'm going to try to log into that database with those credentials. And since it comes back as it's valid, it means, hey, that thing's there. We can utilize that. From there, just like when I did the update tag list on the PLC and it requested its tags on the database side to pull in that structure, we hit enumerate. And you can see I have access to these two groups on the database. So I'll just hit select all. And then within those groups, you can see my tables, my views, and stored procedures and functions that I have access to. So I can simply hit select all or just select the ones I want. If I hit OK. And so right now it's looking at that structure. It's getting the names of those tables, the column names, the variable types of those columns, and it's pulling all that into the module to enable the drag and drop GUI. You can see it finished and said it updated successfully, so I'm good to go there. I can close that out. And if I wanted to add multiple databases there, I could do that. It's just repeat the same process, but you'd obviously have a different IP address and maybe different credentials to log in. So I've connected the two, my controller, I've connected to my database. Now I need to define my transaction. So I come to the middle, hit transaction, new transaction. So you can see these first four here are how we interface to the databases, our traditional SQL databases. So insert, which is what we're going to do first, is probably the simplest and one of the most common, right? I'm going to take data from the PLC and I'm going to insert it into the SQL database. So I'm just going to write data to the database and create records. Updates where I go in and look at the database and change a record. So I'm not really pulling anything down, but I'm just going into the database, searching for something and updating it. And then the select is where I'm selecting data out of the database and pulling it back down into the PLC. And then you have your stored procedures and functions, which is basically, if you're not familiar with that, to have a program on the SQL server coded to do whatever you want. It's got input and output parameters. We don't really care about what happens in that stored procedure. We write data to the inputs. It does whatever it needs to in the database. And when it responds via an output or a record set, we see that and write it back down to the PLC if that's how you have it set up. But sky's really the limit there. It's like I said, it's a coded program that maybe the SQL admins configured on there or somebody else. And we don't care what happens in between. We really just care about the inputs and outputs. So we send it or execute it. And if it returns something, we write it back down. The other ones down here are when we go to AWS or MQTT. So outbound and inbound writing data back and forth. But like I said, we'll start with the insert. So I click new database insert. And let me kind of set the stage here. So if I open Logix and pull that over, and if I scroll down, you can see I have this production count tag. It's obviously not really running a production line. My office is too small for that, right? But it's just a counter. It's on a 2-second counter. This is just to replicate, hey, every 2 seconds we get new product in. Each time that happens, let's create a record in the database and store it. So maybe each one's got its own serial number. We're looking for that to come in. We store that serial number with a timestamp and whatever parameters it may be, and we write that to the database. On the database side, this is the table we're going to write it to. So you can see it's empty, but I'll have an operator, I'll have my timestamp, that production count value, and then what line it was on, etc. So to set this up, it's really simple. We go to database. I only have the one configured, so that's my only option. Select it. From within that database, I need to tell it which table we want to write to. So I say select table. I go to the work in process table. That's the table we were just looking at where it had the operator and the line number. And it's asking me, would you like to copy the complete schema? It's essentially saying, do you want to pull in the whole table to this map? I say yes, and it drops it in there for me. If I hadn't clicked yes and I only wanted to write to certain columns, I would come over here and I could individually drag and drop those in. From there, I need to go to my controller and map up which tags I want. So it's really easy. If they were all together, you could shift highlight and pull them in. Mine are spread out. So I just go through here, I click and drag them in. You can see I have them named to match up. They don't have to be named that, but it's kind of makes it cleaner for everybody to understand what's going on. What you do need to consider here though is the data types, obviously. So you can see this is an int 16. I'm writing to a int 32 in the database, and you'll see we'll get a conversion warning on some of those, but it's going to be fine. But I obviously couldn't take a string of characters and write it into an integer tag. So that's the only thing you really need to look out for in this. And the module will warn you or give you errors on that as well. Since my module's syncing with the NTP server, we have this neat little function in here where I can click Logic and do timestamp and click it. And that's just, hey, this is the time that the module had when this transaction occurred. Otherwise, you can actually take the time from the PLC if you use a GSV instruction and write that in. I also have, like I said earlier, where people have the database populate the time when the record's received. So you can do it multiple different ways, but this is the way I've chosen to do it. So I wanted to point that out. You can see we have constants and function blocks and all kinds of stuff in here as well. So if I do a constant for my name, just do the abbreviation that my family uses there. And since I have everything lined up, I can simply hit connect and I'm done almost. For the most part, I am. So I've defined, we'll just kind of summarize this, right? On the right-hand side is where we're writing data to the table in the SQL database. On the left-hand side is our PLC tag values that we're getting those values out of the PLC and writing them into the table. It's under what conditions do we want this transaction to take place? So to determine that, it's defined by our trigger right here. So if I click trigger, new trigger, we always fire based off something happening in the PLC. So in this case, when I kind of set the stage for it, we said, hey, when this production count value changes in the PLC, let's write some data to the database. So I have a scan period. I can actually lower that to 250 milliseconds. My condition, I'm going to use the change condition, but you can see there's a lot of different options here. If I want to say, hey, when this tag is equal to a certain value, write the data. Another common one is edge equals. So when this tag changes from a 0 to a 1, I want to write the data in that case. Always, if you're doing some type of process or just continuously gathering data no matter what, it says, hey, every 250 milliseconds, let's always store this data. In my case, we're going to use change. And this just says every 250 milliseconds, we're going to scan this tag in the PLC. If its values change from the last time we scanned it, 250 milliseconds before, we're going to execute. If it hasn't changed, we don't do anything. So you're not constantly polling the PLC for all the tags. It's just this one. And you have control of how often that happens based off this scan period. So mine, since it's changing every 2 seconds, we're going to scan it 8 times, and 1 out of the 8 is when we're going to actually write the data. So I saved that guy off and associated it here. I can hit apply. Now, something that's a little bit unique with the module, if you're used to working with Logix and controllers, you can see here I haven't actually hit save on anything. When I hit OK, it is saving it. The module has a solid state drive in it. So it's written that solid state right now. If we were to pull power on it, if I was to unplug it, turn it back on, this is going to be in there. It'll also be in the same state that I left it in when it comes back up. So you can see it's set to run, but this project is not running. So I need to start it. And then lastly, I also need to start this individual transaction by starting that trigger. So this is the trigger where we set up the production count tag that we're monitoring. So I can click on it, hit start. And since I'm writing data to Microsoft SQL, I need to start it as well. And I point that out. It's like, oh, you got to start all these things. Well, it gives you the benefit of I can let this transaction run. I can come back in later at another date and add another transaction, and I won't affect this one. Or I can make changes to other parts of the module, and this one's just going to sit there and run. So you can make online edits without having to bring the entire module down. And I do point that out because it is a nice little feature. Also, if the module was to go into store and forward and it was to lose power, when it comes back up, that data is still in store and forward. So like I said, the module really shines in those applications where your data is critical and you can't lose it. But you can see here, we've executed roughly 23 times, 25. A neat little feature is to hit this debug button, and you can see the data that's being passed, and that is just a one shot, but that's a neat little thing. If we wanted to go to the SQL side, if I execute this query again, you can see we've populated roughly 34 rows. You can see here's our timestamp where it is every 2 seconds, and it's based off that production count tag changing. So it is really simple to get started. The module, to be clear on this, we're not configuring the PLC and we're not configuring the database. We're just bridging those two and trying to make a real clean solution, simple solution for people to configure. And so you can see if after playing with it for a little bit, it doesn't take that long to get familiar. And we also have how-to videos and stuff to help with that, but it's real easy to get up and running. And a lot of people like it for its ease of use as well, and its robustness on the data side. I would point out something. If we wanted to monitor, and I'll actually, if we wanted to monitor the status of these transactions and give that feedback to the PLC, we can do that. That's a lot of times, like if I keep talking about how people's data is critical. So that's one of those key components. If I come down here to handshake, we handshake with the PLC and we handshake with the SQL database. That's how we know when to go into store and forward if something's went offline. So I have a basic integer tag. I have it called trigger basic. It's just a 32-bit int. If I go in here and it's already marked as make tag writable, that's what that pencil is. That just means, hey, the tManager can write to that tag. If I pull it in here, hit apply. And I do need to restart it since I am making a change to it. Make sure it saved that off. If I come back over here, you can see where we restarted it. The changes did take, it reset my counter. But if we were to go look in Logix and we go to the status trigger basic tag, 30 means we're successfully writing to the database. So if I reset that to a 0, each time we successfully write, you get a 30. If I, for instance, was to have something happen on the database side, and I can replicate that by just pausing this endpoint, stopping it. You can see we're now writing a 20, and a 20 means the data is going into store and forward. If I was to jump back here, you can see there's only 7 messages in there where you're using 2-3% of the queue, and that's just a 1 MB queue, right? So we have several gigs worth that we could allocate up to that. But this is just to show you what it looks like when it goes into store and forward. You can monitor it in the PLC to know, hey, this database is offline, but we have the data in the store and forward queue. So for example, if the store and forward queue was to fill up or something like that, we would write a different value. All this stuff's defined in documents we have and in the help file that's in the GUI as well. But I do like showing that feature. So if I was to simply restart this again, you'll see that queue gets cleared. We go back to the PLC and we're now writing a value of a 30. And that just lets you know that it is successfully writing back to the database. If we were to, for example, do a transaction where we're pulling data out of the database, a simple way to do that is with the select. So if I come up here and do new transaction, new database select, you can see it's very similar, but we have a little bit more going on. I need to pick my database again, select the table I want, and that's just the auto table. I'll say yes, but I'm going to actually get rid of some of them. So I'll remove that one. And I'll remove that one as well. So this is the columns in the table that we're going to pull data from. We're going to write them to these values in the PLC. So I need to right click on them, make them writable. Pull them in here. And I dropped them down a little bit. And I'm getting a conversion warning because I'm going from 32-bit integers on these to 16-bit integers. I hit okay because none of my values, that's not going to mess with my accuracy or anything on these because they're smaller. I can pull in, you can see here it's got the mark for an array. If my tags in the PLC, for example, paint type model, if these were arrays as well, I could pull in the whole table really. And I do have customers that use that and like utilizing it. We don't have a tag limit within the module. So in those cases where you have some transactions where you want to move a ton of data with one transaction, the module works out really well with that. So I would point that out. But in my case, since I'm only writing to flat tags, I put in here max rows of 1. I need to tell it how to look up the data. So maybe it'd be best if we go look at that structure. So you can see this is the table. This is the data that's in there. I have RFID value. So I'm just going to trigger off of that in the PLC when we see that that value changes, like to replicate an RFID scanner on the line. When we see that that value changes, we're going to come in here to the database, look up model, paint type, paint level, old type associated with whatever we've put in the PLC. So if I type in a 3 in the PLC, we're going to pull in Volvo 2001 8. If I type in a 7, we'll pull in Honda 617530. So it's just to show you for recipe management or running certain part numbers, that type of stuff, where maybe you have a line that can have a couple hundred different part numbers and they got 50 to 100 parameters or more for each one. It's hard to manage all that in the PLC. PLC is not really to manage that stuff well, whereas a database is. So you could use the module to be a key part of pulling that data out of the database, lets you keep in a smaller memory size in the PLC or a smaller platform, and you can still accomplish what you need to without jumping into a control Logix or something like that. So to set this up, I go to my where clause, and this just says, how do we want to queue this data up? And I say, I want to look up the data where it is equal to RFID in the PLC is equal to RFID in the database. Pretty simple. You can build and or statements with all this stuff to make it as complex as you want, but I'm going to keep it simple and just similar as how a lot of people are using, hey, look up this particular part number. Lastly, we need to tell under what conditions, again, we want this transaction to take place. I'm going to use the same type of trigger. Instead of this time monitoring that production count value, I'm going to use the RFID value. I'll pull that in, hit OK, select that. And I could set up the handshake to monitor all this as well to know, hey, we actually updated data in the PLC if I wanted to. I hit apply to save that off. Need to start my automation endpoint because I'm writing data to the PLC and my trigger to monitor that RFID value. And then if we were to go back into Logix, go to that car UDT. And if I change it to a 1, it sees it, it pulls Toyota. I change it to a 7, it sees that it's changed and it makes that query and pulls in Honda. So that's a real simple way to do recipe management, part number management. Hey, I even have customers who will use that to go look up data and put it on an HMI for like trending and stuff if they want to see how a particular thing ran on a certain day. And use that to put it on their HMI to say, hey, what was the data on this day? And they'll go back to put in on the HMI the date that they're looking for and the part number and pull that data in to see what the parameters were used when that was built. So they're writing to it and pulling it back down for the operator to be able to utilize it and look up previous runs as well. So that's it on the database side. One last thing I'd like to show is connecting the AWS. So this is my AWS IoT core. I've logged into it already. I hit that to copy my unique endpoint. And so we're going to write data. We're going to populate that data on these dashboards. So if we go to database, new, and instead of picking MS SQL, we're going to do MQTT. And I'm going to try to move through this pretty quick so we have time for Q&A. I paste that endpoint in there. I go to advanced. AWS does require encryption, so I do select that. Some MQTT brokers don't. If you're running like Mosquito or one you're managing yourself, you don't have to do that. It's just however you set it up. AWS also requires certificates. You generate those out of AWS and tie it back in. So I already have these in here. Select those. Hit OK to save that off. Now, if we were to just write data out of the PLC into AWS so that we can populate those dashboards, we can do new outbound transaction. This time pick MQTT, but I need to tell it where I want to write it to. So a topic is kind of think of it as not as a table like a database, but how do I keep the data streams clear? So if I want certain things to see data from certain other devices, certain other IoT devices, like for instance, my dashboard is set up to receive data from this particular topic. So if I was to put something else in here when I was writing it to AWS, it would never make it to the dashboard because the dashboard's looking for it to come in on that particular topic. So I put that in there. Hit validate, just much like we did on the database. Hey, can we actually log in? I can. So I hit OK on that, select it. I go to my PLC tags. You can see I have these UDTs for a wind turbine. Since there is no structure for the table, you need to define a JSON structure. The module will do that for you, so you don't have to type it in by hand if it's in a UDT or an array. So you can see I right-clicked on that UDT, hit generate JSON structure. We'll say CSIA, hit OK. It imports it. Now if I go over here, I can select it. It's asking me, do I want to copy everything from this? I do. And then I can come over here, simply shift highlight, drag these in, hit connect. Under what conditions do I want this data to write? In this case, since we're just replicating, hey, this is a wind turbine, it's out there, we're continuously gathering data from it. We'll do a new trigger. We'll leave it as at 1,000. We'll actually change this to always. So every second, let's gather data from this. Select that. Hit apply to save those changes. And then I need to start my MQTT endpoint and my third trigger. So you can see these others have continued to run, much like I said in the beginning. And you can see now that I've started it, we've populated 7 records. If I want to see the data being passed again, I'll simply hit that debug button. But if I actually want to see it in AWS, you can see we've now started populating that data. The average won't run because it calculates the average every 5 minutes. So I'd need to leave this running. But you can see again, it's a real clean, easy way to move data into different systems. So in this case, it's completely different from a database. It's writing into AWS IoT Core. It's still not super common on the industrial side, but I do have customers that are using it. I'd say by far it's still Microsoft SQL's our dominant connectivity, but this is growing, so I did want to point it out and maybe put some seeds if you have people running into that or you're thinking about it in the future as well. So with that being said, I'll switch back to my PowerPoint real briefly to give you my contact information. So you can follow me on LinkedIn to find me. If you want a demo, feel free to reach out to me, please, directly. I'm happy to hear from you. So I'll leave this up and I'll start looking at some of the Q&A and the chat as well to answer those. And I'll try to make sure we're not running out of time or anything as well. So let me look at that. So the first one I see is with the compact Logix, can it pull data from the local chassis controller, or did I hear you need to connect externally via Ethernet IP to get local data since it doesn't talk via backplane? You're exactly right, Mr. Brown. So the compact Logix is a little bit unique compared to the control Logix because it does all its communication via Ethernet IP. We did that to kind of get the price down on it compared to the control Logix. So we do use a Rockwell chip to talk across the backplane and the control Logix. We buy it from them, pay royalties on it. So the compact Logix doing everything via Ethernet IP out the front ports. It's not as ideal, I guess we would say, but it just, you can still put it in rack to pull power if it's in the same form factor, but it would still communicate via Ethernet IP. So you wouldn't see the backplane rack. It's actually invisible in the IO tree if you were to have it in there, but your connection to the PLC would just be as simple as, hey, I'm talking to a compact Logix and I input the IP address and connect to it. So it isn't, it goes both ways, I guess, depending on the setup. Mr. Chambers asks, is there a benefit to using a message instruction as a trigger instead of a different tag type? So it's something I didn't go into. There's multiple ways to set up those triggers. I showed you the most common. One of the ways is where you actually configure a SIP message instruction from the PLC and it sends it to the tManager and tells it when to fire. I wouldn't say there's a huge benefit to the message instruction because I'll point this out, the feedback that you're getting from the tManager is still going to be that handshake tag, whether it's a SIP message instruction type trigger or the regular tag type. So the only time that I would really push for someone using the SIP message instruction is when you're trying to get under that scan time of 250 milliseconds. If you're not, you're still controlling the tag that we're looking at. Like in my change, you're still controlling it. In my trigger where I'm monitoring for the change, I apologize, on that tag, the controller is still toggling that, much like it's sending the SIP message instruction. So in my view, the only benefit with using the message instruction is when you're actually trying to get under that scan time. So I would point that out. Otherwise, it is a little bit more complicated to configure. I do have customers who like to use that more so than the other one. But in my opinion, we're still monitoring a tag. You're still changing that tag And when we see that change with a regular periodic tag, that's still controlling when it's sent, just like you are with a message instruction. There's another question about different adapter types. So the compact Logix tManager as it stands today can communicate to Siemens and Modbus TCP as well as the Rockwell controllers. So I would point that out. That's capable of that. I would talk to us if you're going down that path just to see, so we can make sure that your type's supported, because it's not a wide variety of things, but the S7s and stuff like that, yeah, they're supported. Another question, this one comes up quite a bit, is the minimum Logix PLC firmware required. So what's unique about the module is we're doing SIP communication. So SIP's like an ODVA standard. So data highway SIP, control net SIP, Ethernet IP SIP, they're all doing the same type of calls, but it's over different physical media. That's how we can bridge. Like I even have customers who bridge through a data highway bridge or a control net bridge to those older PLCs. We just need the path to get there. So to answer your question, there's not a minimum firmware revision. It was back tested to like version 15. But we're not based off the firmware version of how we communicate. So I hope that's clear. Something that we haven't talked about too in depth, and I'll look at these other questions as well, but something to be aware of. Like I said, there is no tag limit on the module. There is a transaction limit. It is a limited piece of hardware, and that transaction limit's 25. So you can put 1,000 tags in each transaction and move 25,000 tags of data, or you could do 10. But that is something to be aware of if you're scoping this out or something like that. If you are getting that far down, please reach out to me, and we can set up a demo and discuss your application, see if it fits or not.
So
Another,
one of
yeah.
the questions that came in is, and forgive me if you've already answered this, can tManager talk to multiple databases? And if so, how many? It kind of got out of the order in the string in the Q&A, so I didn't want you to be confused about
No,
that
you're good.
thread. Okay.
So it can talk to multiple. We don't have a hard limit set in there. I've had like if I was to pull mine back up, you can see I was talking to Microsoft SQL and MQTT at the same time. If I wanted to talk to MySQL at the same time, I could do that and have 3. And then even within that, I could have multiple Microsoft SQL databases, multiple MQTT connections, and multiple MySQL connections. Now, if you told me, hey, I want to talk to 20 databases, I'd be like, it may be feasible, but I don't know of anybody ever doing that. The most I've had is typically somebody's talking to 3 or 4 different databases at once with one module. And there's actually redundancies that we can set up within the module. I didn't go into like the store and forward settings and the failover settings, but I can set it up to like, hey, if this database goes offline, let's switch over to a different database and set it up to where it's redundant on the database side as well. So I hope that helps. I don't have a hard limit on the amount of databases that we can connect to, but if you're going to try to do more than 3 or 4, you may run into some potentially weird behavior or something like that. I don't know of any of that just because I typically don't have people talking to more than that with one module. But there is not a hard limit. And yes, you can talk to multiple databases as well as multiple database types. Is there a way to view configuration of a backup without being connected to a module? So that transaction configuration, I don't know if you saw that, but it's in the very beginning when I was going through settings where you can take transactions and move them from one module to another. That transaction configuration is actually in XML. So it is pretty cumbersome to look through and wade through. You can look at it. You can't make edits to it and load it back in. It is hashed, so the module would reject it if those changes had been made. But you can look at the MVM XML and look at it that way. So Yes, would be the answer to that, I guess, in my roundabout way of it. Long-winded answer there. Something that I would point out as well, you don't have to have the controller and the tManager in the same rack. It can be in another rack that's bridged together. It can be completely independent and connect to it via Ethernet IP. Another question here is the MQTT QoS levels. So we abide by MQTT 3.1.1. In the future, it'll be MQTT version 5 as well, but we haven't rolled that out. So we support that. 0, 1, and 2, I think, are the 3 QoS levels. We support all that. We have the last will and testament and stuff as well on the MQTT side. Question about what ControlLogix hardware modules are needed to be used for the communications. Just our module, everything self-contained within that. If you are, we still pass through the network like you would with RS Link. So you could set up the module to where it does that, or you could set the module up to where it just goes out its front ports and talks to stuff on the network that way. We are not able to connect to Access or Excel. We did years ago, but we no longer support that. That's a question. Do we use tManager software to update the firmware for new product enhancements? Yes, so within the UI, there's a that I had open earlier, there is a firmware tab. You can utilize that. The firmware can be downloaded and you just go in and update it. I would say that with the caveat is like, unless you're having some type of weird issues, please reach out to us. I didn't put the support line on here, but it's support@softing.us. And then let's talk about that. You shouldn't be having any issues. So maybe there's a bug fix or something like that. It's not common, but it does come up depending on your unique application. I say all that to say is there are firmware updates. They're free and available to update, but a lot of times you may be adding, like one of the more recent ones is we added support for Postgres, some new open source type database that's growing. So maybe there's not a benefit to updating your firmware, but do be aware that that's out there and they are free and available to update. But a lot of times I'll talk to people that have had modules installed for years and years and they haven't updated them. And unless you're changing to a newer SQL database or something like that, you may not want to update, it just depends. How is this module set up with redundancy ControlLogix? That's an awesome question. So the module itself, if you were to do it redundant, if you have redundant ControlLogix racks, right, where one switches over to the other automatically, I would put the tManager in a standalone option and do everything via Ethernet IP. So when it's pointing at the primary controller, it's just doing it via IP address. If this one was the fail and this switches over, to us, we don't know the difference because it's all via IP, right? Now, if you're talking about redundant tManagers, you can have that set up as well. I didn't show it, but you can have a supervisory controller that's monitoring the tManager and telling it when to fire up, when to not, when to stop things, when to start. So if you were to do that, you'd have 2 tManagers. The controller would point to both of those. It would be monitoring the first one. If it was for some reason to fail or quit, you could then say, hey, start up. They would be identical of each other. But that's how you would do it. So if you were but I think you're talking about a primary rack and a secondary rack, just put the tManager in a different location. When this stuff switches over to us, it doesn't matter because it's all via IP address. Another question, kind of similar to that, is if the module's in rack, does it have to be defined within the IO tree? It does not. You can if you want that feedback like I'm talking about, but it does not have to be defined. And that's kind of crucial in certain applications, right? Maybe it's something that's already regulated and approved and they don't want to have to make changes to the program. With our module, you don't have to do that. It communicates very similar to a HMI. We don't eat up a lot of the time slice or anything like that. And I think that's all the questions. There may have been some more added, but we can get to those. I know we're at the top of the hour, so I'll hand it back over to Lisa. Thank you all.
Thank you, Quentin. And so now my final little words here on behalf of CSIA. I would like to thank our speaker, Quentin, for this informative discussion. I would also like to thank Softing for sponsoring the event. And of course, thank you for attending. Be sure to bookmark the CSIA events calendar so you don't miss any upcoming events. And that's a wrap. Once again, thank you for attending and have a great day.